The Avatar cartoon series is a classic at this point, a high-quality animated production presented as a multi-season epic for children and family. With its larger-than-normal TV budget, it was able to create masterful scenes, both dramatic and action-y. It focused on a world where humans have evolved to control the four elements of fire, while it refers to a reincarnating spirit in this world who is able to master all four elements, with him being reborn in a cycle through those four cultures with each life. The show immediately hones in on how that lore can be exploited by introducing us to the world with the Airbender people being wiped to near extinction by the Fire Tribe, as they knew that the next Avatar would be born to the Airbenders. Aang, the titular last Airbender, escaped this and ended up frozen in a glacier for 100, and thus the spirit of the Avatar is stuck in some sort of limbo, unable to return. The series begins with Aang being set free from this glacier, a task greater perhaps than any other Avatar has faced at an impossibly young age. The series was a hit, and ultimately, I think the scripting for the Netflix Avatar series does adapt the cartoon very strongly. I don't claim it's perfect, some moments feel rushed, but many moments from the original feel like they have more room to breathe in this hour-long format. The 8-hour-long episodes focus on the key stories from Season 1, leaving out the fluffy episodic plots and taking their important information to be used again in these new hour-long adaptations. Most moments land better in the animated series overall, and the live action does have some stuff that works great for it in terms of writing. However, that writing isn't helped by the live action footer. As far as changes go, the transition to a live-action cast with live-action stunts and low-budget 3D animation feels like it hurt the show. The more drawn-out and dramatic introduction to the conflicts of the world and Aang's life are definitely great in the live-action, but it can feel rather cheesy with these sets and costumes on real actors, and such young actors taking on such brutal roles. Ultimately, I feel like the show, as a reboot, suffered from trying to be too close to the original, and failed to put enough money into the action sequences and sets, which helped make the animated series so beloved, longer than the actual two-part opener of the animated series. But it does use its additional 20 minutes to give us a more dramatic look into Aang's origins, instead of it being spelled out for us after the fact. We also get more of a look at Sokka and Katara's life in the village, helping me feel sympathy for them right off of the bat. And in many ways, the dramatics of the first episode do feel more serious than compared to the original show, which was very well known for beautiful and detailed background art. Don't get me wrong, it's just a reminder that a lot of what makes Avatar art is that it is literal art given its proper budget. They regularly have great complex fight scenes, while also not abusing stills and animation tricks in their normal scenes. They used every trick just as any anime-like production would, but with so much money that even the cheaper scenes, which was very good for what Avatar was putting together. The live-action show, meanwhile, has a budget of $15 million per episode, and if we split that based on runtime, they were paying about $5 million for 22 minutes. Right, but when you have a baseline budget that you know it will recoup, it doesn't have some sort of escalating cost. It's the same artist in the same workflow, just drawing different things in the same pipeline. The same is not true for live action, particularly when trying to recreate sequences from animation. First off, the fantasy additions to the real-life martial arts in the Avatar cartoon only work in animation, whether 2D or 3D. It only works when the human mind is able to, frame by frame, decide what visual angle and motion actually looks realistic. Making real humans simulate that motion in or 3D animation. Most of what we think of as good action fantasy sequences in live-action films rely heavily on 3D animation these days, so much so that people can feel uncomfortable in 3D. Even with that, the cost it takes to make these 3D sequences look great is much closer to the budget of an Avengers film, $225 million, or across 22 minutes, $35 million, more than twice the cost of an episode of the Netflix Avatar adaptation. With that in mind, and the attempts to recreate the action of the cartoon specifically, it just feels rather cheesy and hokey, with a weird mishmash of low-budget CG that is trying to convince me it's good CG just because it's more than what Game of Thrones paid for. One of the best action sequences in the show is its opening, where 3D animation is used seemingly exclusively, and to hide this, have to show the faces of actors who have essentially no martial arts or stunt training, and 3D animation can only be used here and there in order to make it look like they are fighting, leading to very awkward looking fight scenes across the entire show, whether they're doing something original or trying to match a fight scene from the cartoon. Perhaps my most mixed feelings came around episode 4, which was something I was looking forward to seeing in the slightly more serious tone that who is now aged into a very old man, but who recognizes Aang since Aang himself has not aged. The Netflix series completely recontextualizes the original animated episode, bringing it to much more dramatic heights than the original, since the audience is expected to largely know this early on, before any challenges instead of afterwards. Bumi, instead of trying to bond with Aang, is determined to test him, having feelings of being abandoned by someone he thought would be a hero, and having grown up through a century of war. Bumi puts Aang through various trials like in the cartoon, but in the live action they seem a lot more sadistic, and Bumi shows real insanity instead of the silliness from the cartoon. He is someone who is shaped by war and wants Aang to be ready for it, not just revealing his innocent child beneath the surface. The action as a whole in the original is so good that it only ever emphasizes the drama, whereas here in the live action it feels like the action ruins the changes that I liked. Bumi's breakdown about how he can't rely on anyone because Aang left him hanging in a world that was slowly being destroyed by the Fire Nation would have landed so well with beautiful 2D action, but it just suddenly feels nerfed by the attempts of the live action to have the characters do weird flips. This is ultimately my favorite episode in the live action, and one that really feels like a second draft of the original story in terms of writing, but one that still doesn't make me want to come back to the series as a whole. It's one very strong change in a show that mostly just attempts to recreate the original, and that itself always falls flat because the original just looks better. This is most obvious to me in episode 7, which involved Katara challenging the Northern Water Tribe Bending Master because she wants to fight in the war. This is a battle that I felt was close to the original and not in a good way. I hadn't seen the animated version of the fight in years, but I just remember the action hitting so much harder than in the Netflix series and had to go back to compare these two in particular multiple times. One big difference in the live action version is the constant ooh and awe from the audience who is announced, because it's really just allowing for the directors to are meant to make us feel like this is impressive to see, and it just makes it all the more awkward as if they are trying to force us to react this way. In the original cartoon, there was cheering, but it wasn't every time someone did something cool. It was every time Katara herself withstood an attack. It was because she got up every time she was knocked down that the people would cheer. It wasn't cheering at the special effects to make the audience feel like they should be in awe too. It was a reminder of what mattered as the ice crystals close in on her, instead of just expertly animated sequences of them falling from the sky around her so perfectly. And I think the difference in those two shots really just highlights the problem with trying to adapt animation into live action so closely, and really at all. On the flip side, the finale relies heavily on visual humans involved in the action itself, similar to when you have a superhero wearing his mask. This allows for essentially everything to be 3D animated, and as such it looks solid. Seeing Aang become a giant Godzilla monster hit very similar to the cartoon, having a very similar thrill of being in awe for the very first time because of how much like a Hollywood monster movie it was, as opposed to a beautiful use of traditional animation. I remember being in a state of awe when Aang first took on his giant water form in the cartoon, and didn't expect them to be able to replicate that here in the live action. But they did by essentially tackling the scene in an entirely new way, investing in making it artful and powerful in a completely different way than the animated version, going almost more your new medium can take advantage of instead of just trying to simulate the original. You see, adaptations are nothing new, but it seems like we are in an age of nothing but adaptations and reboots and remakes, and it's become hard to tell what the point of this is anymore. As film was first developing as a medium, remakes for popular stories made sense, as the transition to color and sound gave stories a completely different feel. As the advances in technology began to slow down, however, the big changes between one decade and another became largely just cinematic presentation that was changing in remakes. A great example of this is Hitchcock's Psycho. Most people are well aware of the original black and white film, but in an attempt to remake it in color, Psycho was given an almost shot-for-shot remake. This was awkward and uncanny, and it treated the movie-making process like a science that is supposed to get a specific reaction out of people, instead of an art form, ever into a remake of Psycho and expect them to capture a performance simply by copying the original shot for shot. This allowed the original to have its sanctity as these films as reboots and focused on changing the way we approach the material altogether. Perhaps one of the most interesting examples of this is the Planet of the Apes franchise. The original series were low-budget sci-fi films that are considered hokey by today's standards, something proven by the attempt from Tim Burton to remake the first film in the early 2000s. Attempt to take the same bones and make it work in a new way, and it failed. People laughed at the movie, and it seemed like Planet of the Apes was a franchise that just shouldn't be touched. I loved the original, and thus was very skeptical when the Rise of the Planet of the Apes film came out in the 2010s, but I was blown away when I saw it. The original film is left untouched by this adaptation, and is even given enough nods that you can imagine it in the same universe, but what we get from Rise of the Planet of the Apes as a whole is a more grounded, realistic approach to showing how our planet would eventually become run over by apes. Story to feel fresh with its more realistic approach. The idea of taking something and making it a lot more serious really got popularized by Batman, whose Dark Knight trilogy had inspired many franchises to take something more silly or soft from our childhoods and to play it out in a gritty, serious way, but that wasn't the only clever way to adapt something. Whereas DC leaned into its grim dark reboots, Marvel leaned into being this self-aware parody that attempts to inject a little bit of wholesomeness into the narrative at dramatic moments. Ultimately, the key to adapting something is just making it wildly different from the original, in my opinion, and the more they try to make it, just becomes a matter of comparing the two versions in your head, as the new one is very directly trying to remind you of the original in order to convince you that this product was worth purchasing. What worked best for the Netflix Avatar series was when it went in its own direction with things, allowing for not a better story overall, but just exploring different sides of characters and their interactions, if nothing else. I'm not saying that every reboot or remake needs to, but what do you guys think? Am I just a weird 30-year-old who is burnt out on reboot culture, or is there something to this that is genuine